Welcome to part 2 of our Cold Steel Saber comparison series, this episode featuring the Thompson Saber. This is Lynn Thompson's attempt to make a unique saber for the modern martial artist. But it's not a unique build from the ground up. Basically what they did is they took their discontinued Austrian 1904 hilt and married it to, we'll talk about this sheath here in a second, their 1796 blade, and then they just blackened the whole thing. Now, given my prior experience with their 1796 saber, you see previous installments for that drama, I figured I would have to do a significant amount of reshaping and reprofiling to turn this into something that worked for me. In other words, I bought it as a project. But as it turns out, I didn't have to do nearly as much work to this as I thought I would. First up, let's talk about this sheath, and I'm calling it a sheath because it's not reinforced. It's just leather, so therefore it's flexible. Now it does have a blackened steel shape and, well, kind of a half reinforcement up at the top. Reminds me a lot of what I see on my Frontier Bowie and my Rifleman's knife. And speaking of which, it seems to take a lot of other design cues from the sheaths on those blades, where you've got a frog that's attached with a little button and a rotating strap. But the problem is, and I'll cover this a little bit in carry later, when I'm hanging it from my belt, well, first of all, that strap kind of gets blocked by the shell of the guard in its current position. So that makes it a little weird and awkward and canted, and it just, as you can see, under its own weight, hangs perfectly vertically. I've talked about this in other videos about wearing and drawing swords. That doesn't work for me. Now I make it work a little bit better by rotating it downwards and having it that way, but yeah, that doesn't really help it from hanging vertically. It does keep that strap clear of the guard, makes it a little bit higher so I'm not tripping over it quite so much, but yeah, this really could benefit from having either a lower hanger or, yes, a second hanger. But coincidentally, since we are talking about a sword that has a 1796 blade, it does indeed fit perfectly in my existing 1796 scabbard. I'm going to try to give you the best view I can of the friendly end because, yeah, it's basically black on black with a side of black. Really hard to see. I mean, how much more black could this be? And the answer is none. None more black. But as I've already mentioned, this is Cold Steel's 1904 Austrian Saber hilt, which means it has kind of a reasonably plain shell guard that is drilled out with a bunch of holes, and yeah, a couple of slots that could be for a sword knot or a tassel. Like the 1796, you have the metal backstrap with the ears, and through the ears is a hammered in metal pin side to side. Now you're going to see some discoloration there because when this came to me, hammering it in created some indentations on either side, and yeah, I can feel the hammered edges of the pin. Those were filled in with some kind of black paste, almost like a Bondo, that flaked off during use. So I went ahead and just scraped it all away and put some bluing on it. But because it was just cold bluing, it keeps wearing off with my hand oils, which is why you see it kind of faded. There are some interesting details on that backstrap in terms of some checkering, but it's not very positive. So I'm not really feeling any extra grippiness to it, maybe a little tactile indexing. Speaking of which, the inside space of the grip, this is actually not only the narrowest grip of the three swords we're going to be looking at in terms of front to back, but it's also the longest one. You've got a full 5 inches in here, 12.5 centimeters, which allows you to really choke down if you want to get your thumb up the back. And yeah, my thumbs are really short. I've got plenty of room to get a saber grip on here. I can also choke up and use it in other ways depending on, well, what I'm doing with it. We'll talk about that a little bit more in martial handling, just like we'll talk about the protection that the guard gives you and, well, symmetry or lack thereof, and how does that affect handling. Another interesting detail, let's see if I can show it to you here with the light. There is a collar at the top. Now, on the front side, it's rounded and actually recessed, so not in the way at all, no hot spots in the front or the side. But in the back, it does stick up a bit. As you can see, there's a bit of a shelf overhang there. Now, it hasn't become a hot spot. Don't really notice it, but I suppose if it did, I could reshape it, hammer it down. The grip itself, that is fake rayskin. How do I know? Well, it melts with some nice twisted wire, the only part on the sword that isn't black on black with a side of black. And as for construction, I think like the Cold Steel 1796, it's a combination of this pin through the tang side to side and, flip it around, get it in the light, you can see this rectangular-ish shape at the bottom. I don't think that's a peen block. I think that is a end sleeve nut. But I haven't been using this very gently and nothing's come loose. Grip overall is quite comfortable, though, yeah, for my delicate hands, I did reduce the spikiness of the fake rayskin. Now, as I mentioned in the intro, all the sabers we're looking at come with blades made out of 1055 carbon steel with an HRC somewhere around 52, which is perfectly fine for a through-hardened sword blade. They also come sharpened from the factory on the primary edge, but not the false edge, so that was something I had to deal with. But even though this is a 1796 cold steel blade, some of the specs aren't quite the same as the one I had so many challenges with. So maybe they were different batches, or maybe they improved them over time. One of the biggest telltales is the, well, termination of the fuller. It terminates like a traditional 1796 saber with kind of that squared off ricasso sort of shape there, whereas my other one just sort of fades out at the bottom. That should have let me know there were some differences, and there's some other differences in, well, certain specifications, but not others. Okay, so blade length, I did not cut this one down, so this is still sitting at 32 inches, and that's measured at a straight line from the guard to the tip, so 81 centimeters. Width, front to back, edge to spine. Width of, just like the other one, 1 3/8 inches, about 3.5 centimeters. Now, distal taper on this one from the factory, 8 millimeters thick at the base, so a little bit thicker than my other 1796. And without any reduction to speak of whatsoever, we'll talk about modifications in a second, right here at about the ogive of the tip, that's about 3 millimeters. Let's go ahead and take a look at the distal flex. It's pretty stiff, but yes, does bend somewhat more towards the foible, which I feel is correct. And we'll see how this performs under thrusting impact as well. Unlike the 1796 I had so much disappointment and challenge with, shaping of this blade, I would say, is barely ripply at all. Now, there was just a little bit of unevenness of the spine that I adjusted as I did some work to it. What work did I do to it? Well, I did improve the edge because the edge grind was just a little steep and ragged. It did not have any kind of false edge on it. There was a good millimeter plus of blunt. So I did reprofile the false edge and then just blended it all nicely together in a lenticular cross section. And that did also reduce a little bit of the meat behind the edge at the foible. And of course, some of the reshaping of the spine took a little bit of steel off here. Now what that wound up doing, and yeah, I did just go ahead and polish and re-blacken the whole thing, but what that wound up doing to the other specifications, weight. It started out as 2 pounds 1 ounce, about 935 grams. So actually, despite having more beef in the guard, a little bit lighter than the 1796 when it first came to me. But after a little bit of reprofiling, I brought it down to about 2 pounds and a quarter of an ounce, about 914 grams. What did that do to the point of balance? Well, I mentioned how bad the point of balance was on the 1796 at 8.5 inches. Yeah, originally this was at 8 1/4, so 21 centimeters from the guard. The removal I did brought it down an inch. So right now it's sitting at about 7.5 inches, about 19 centimeters. So certainly further forward than, well, my reprofiled 1796. But we will talk about how that has affected the handling. In the 1796 review, I talked about how I'm going to take a pass on the paper cut test. But let's go ahead and see how this edge pushes through a piece of corrugated cardboard. Yeah. No damage. So what did you just see? As I mentioned in the last video, I'm still trying to work out my ideal sword testing protocol. But starting with thrusting stabbing into my pel, which is multiple layers of thick cardboard backed up by a couple of inches in compressed brown paper bag paper, up against my redwood target, and then to check harder impact straight into the redwood. What am I looking for? Well, in the softer media penetration and channel into the media, this blade has a great balance between acuteness and width, so I got good penetration and a very nice wide channel. There are some particular challenges with thrusting stabbing with a really curved blade that we'll talk about in the Marshall section. But into the harder target, I'm looking at tip durability, and held up just fine. Now, in both, I'm also looking to see how the weapon translates that linear impact back into my hand. Does my hand stay put on the grip? Does it collide uncomfortably with anything? And since I have plenty of room in this grip, I could keep it really low away from the guard. But even when it was closer to the guard, it's a nice smooth surface. Collision was not uncomfortable. I had enough room that a couple of times I risked putting my thumb up the back saber grip style, which I normally wouldn't do, especially thrusting into a hard target, because for me that's a recipe for a busted thumbnail. I'm usually going to float my thumb around the side if I'm going to be thrusting stabbing into anything resistant. Now, the grippy part of the grip was indeed very grippy. The back strap a bit smooth, but not enough that I really noticed a problem with it as compared to, say, the 1796 that has a lot bigger, slicker back strap. But the other thing I'm looking for in this case is blade flex. So I'm thrusting in, well, what's fundamentally seconded and cut. Blade horizontalish, facing away from and towards the camera, so you could see it flex. Now, when I threw my hand more over the tip in the thrust, you did see some flex in there. Not so much if I was more conservative and kept my hand behind the tip, but you saw some springiness to the blade. How did it compare to the other swords in the series? Well, we're going to do the side-by-side, so hang in there and wait for that comparison result. But I'm going to say, yeah, I didn't see a whole lot of flex, and even though it did flex some, it didn't take a set or any other kind of damage. So pass the test. Speaking of passing the test, the next one was the bamboo test. Hacking and slashing into a piece of dry bamboo to see if I can induce chip or roll and fragile edge. Now, I'm not trying to hack through the thing. I am striking quickly and conservatively like I would when I'm fencing. It's really to see what the material does to the blade, not the other way around. And this blade did really well. Now, another thing that test does for me is also kind of tells me how nimble the blade is. And yeah, this is a pretty blade-forward blade, so I did feel that weight inertial drag a bit, but I could still definitely make it work well for me. Speaking of working well for me, the final test, cutting. And this is where I admit again that I don't do a lot of cutting. It is far less than 5% of my practice. It is mostly solo drills and partner practice, fencing. I will cut to test a new blade. I will cut to test a new edge on an old blade, or with a weapon that I am not very familiar with, like a sword that is really curved, because yeah, the mechanics are different. There are advantages to it in cutting, but also some disadvantages in that I have to get myself closer to the target and often start lower down with more of a draw cut to get the optimal cutting mechanics out. I also, as I mentioned in the previous video, I don't cut pool noodles and water bottles because I've been informed they are not recyclable in my area. So I exclusively right now, because I can't afford tatami, cut cardboard, which could be really bad on the blade. You don't know what's in that material. It could be really abrasive and damaging. But I also know it's recyclable even if I cut it up in really tiny pieces. So in this case, I was using panels, which give me a good sense of how the blade will pass through the material and also my own cutting angle. If I get sloppy, it will definitely let me know. But in this case, yeah, focusing on horizontal cuts for consistency, going back and forth, so basically 5 and 6 angles, if you're familiar with that. Yeah, really great cutter with a lot of authority in the blade. So I'm going to say when it comes to cutting, I'm impressed. All right, so another bear with me moment before I talk about my martial impressions of this sword, recapping what I talked about in part 1, starting with, okay, my list of criteria for evaluating swords. Number 1 on the list, specs, does it fit me? Number 2 and 3 summed up when somebody asks if something's battle ready. Part of that, is it sharp? Will it cut? And my concern for its cutting capacity might be a little bit different than yours, since I don't do a lot of just strict target cutting. But the second part of that, they're going to ask, you know, is it going to break if I hit stuff with it? Is it durable? And yeah, I do have a lot of confidence in these cold steel builds, but I'm still going to test it. And this one has proven itself to be impressively durable, as expected. But then the next criteria, more complex, it's martial capacity. For a weapon of this size, I'm going to be asking, okay, do I feel confident defending and offending with it? So can I protect myself, parry, block, displace an opponent's blade? And what's its counterattacking capacity? And that is about different kinds of cutting mechanics and tip geometry. And one of the things we specifically talked about in the last video with these really curved sabers is how I've been able to use that curve, not for, you know, monster slicing through targets, but actually kind of backwards to be able to very quickly get that tip around corners through guards. And it'll roll into that on contact with your opponent's weapon or guard very quickly and get into a space that they might have a lot of trouble dealing with. That's also why I like having that sharpened back edge, because back cutting comes into play in the same application. Also, the curvature of the spine I've been able to use to kind of hook in displacing an opponent's weapon, and the steel-on-steel contact is with my spine and not with my edge, so that's kind of comforting. Also, it helps to have some kind of hook or shield down here in case something slides down the back of my blade in the process. But yeah, that's another good way for me to control the opponent's sword and get my business end in some place that they're going to have trouble dealing with it. And we did talk a little bit about, speaking of defensive capability, we'll talk about how this particular shell guard works, but I ultimately do need to know, this gets back to specs, is am I going to be able to move this thing responsively against a responsive, unpredictable opponent, one that may, well, not be equally armed either. I'm looking for variety. Yes, I do cross-training with my weapons. So yeah, I've been doing a little bit of one-handed Japanese sword with my sabers and some saber work with my Japanese style swords and using this like a Chinese dao and even using it like a back sword. So yeah, I've learned how to make it work. But certain features of that curvature, extra added potential. All right, that said, let's talk about this one. Now, as I said in the last chapter, at the end I will compare all three sabers in this series, martially speaking, let you know what my favorites are. But for this one, let's go ahead and start with the friendly end. And that comes down to grip and the guard. I did complain a lot about that 1796 having too much of a slick backstrap where I really had to white knuckle the thing to get control over it. But I also mentioned how, you know, a combination of grippiness and slippiness is really good if you are manipulating your weapon finely with your fingers and some of those really quick actions. This one, though, definitely does it better. I'm not feeling too much slip with that backstrap, and I'm getting extra grip with the fake grayskin. Yes, I did smooth it just a little bit for my comfort. But I'm also getting good use out of the longer grip. It allows me different options for choking down, put my thumb on the back saber style, or I usually use it just a little bit more mid-grip, which gives me the most use of that finger control. Also, another thing that having the longer grip does, it allows me to transition it to my left hand, because I do practice ambidextrously, without tripping over my own fingers. It's just a little added surprise bonus. But as for the guard, all right, in our next episode, we're definitely going to look at a heavy brass side-biased 3-bar guard. Now, they were made that way, assuming the person, well, is specifically using their right hand, and it's for carry. A guard that's bulky on both sides doesn't necessarily carry well from the belt. But not only is there lopsided hand protection where you don't have much for your thumb, but again, I'm using swords ambidextrously. If I switch to the other hand, I got nothing on the back of my hand now. But I think one of the worst things we're going to talk about in the next review is if that guard is really beefy and really lopsided, it does make the grip feel lopsided to one side. This one, though, even though it is biased to the right, definitely, it's a durable sheet steel, so dense enough but not too dense. But it also does extend a reasonable amount to the left, more than enough to cover my thumb. Also, if I shift to the left hand, it's just about enough to cover the back of my hand. But in either hand, despite it visually being lopsided, it doesn't feel lopsided, and that's pretty awesome for a guard like this. Now, as for the business end, okay, I did mention this is kind of the most blade forward of the three already. And a couple of things martially that does for me is it gives me a lot of confidence in its ability to stop an incoming attack. It's got blade authority, inertia. I feel like it can take and stop a pretty good hit. But that might slow my recovery in a cut, so I have to be a little bit careful about that. Now, my wrist isn't quite up to the point where I can easily rotate this thing from just the wrist. So a lot of times what I'm doing is I'm moving more of the arm, shoulder, body, everything to propel it. And you're going to see me using skills that I learned in other kinds of swordsmanship. I'm going to initially start the cut at least by leading with my hand more. It's also what I'm going to do if I'm parrying or feinting. When I'm doing a feint, I haven't fully committed the cut yet, so I'm really not telegraphing whether I'm going to cut or not cut, because the cut's going to look the same here no matter what I'm doing. But if I'm going to follow through with it and I need to recover fast, yeah, I'm going to pull it back from the hilt to give me that speed of recovery. So it does feel a little bit more cumbersome than some of my more nimble blades, but I am learning how to work with it. As I said, I've taken some steel off of it. I could take more. I don't think I'm gonna. I don't think I wanna. I'm appreciating the workout and, yes, what this blade's inertia can do, which is also how much authority power it does have. in some of the cuts, but it also has that curvature, and we talked about this in the last video, that I can use to get around corners. It's now got a sharpened back edge for the back cutting, and that extra weight and blade forwardness does, as it engages an opponent's weapon or guard, make it roll a little bit faster and give me more authority in the hooking displacement of the spine. Plus it does have something to stop something sliding down the back, so we've got that as well. So the things I like having in a saber, it has. The only real downside it has for me is it might be just a little bit heavier than I like, but I do feel I just have to deal with it and learn to work with it and let it do the things that it's good at. All right, I will give you my final thoughts. Which is my favorite martially of the three at the end of part 3. But until then, if you have this saber or other cold steel sabers or other sabers you'd like to recommend, let's get our conversation started. Otherwise, thank you all so much, as always, for watching, liking, subscribing, following my journey, putting up with my madness, and I hope to see you back for part 3, the conclusion. We're going to 19th century France.